After two fairly steady draws, the World Chess Championship really came to life in the third game. This was an absorbing struggle in every phase of this game that lasted almost 7 hours. It was incredibly tense, and the result really remained open right until the very last moves. Well, let's join the game after 20 moves. Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, has the white pieces, and there are great similarities between the endgame that they've reached here and the endgame that they reached in the first game of the match. So Carlsen has a rook and a knight against a rook and a bishop, and once again this bishop of Karjakin's doesn't really do a great deal. Hasn't got a great diagonal to operate on, whereas that knight can hop around very happily, like a kind of poke and probe in black's position. So Carlsen has, well, let's say, the more comfortable position. However, let's leap ahead 11 moves. Karjakin has found some good counterplay. You can see this rook is very active, putting a bit of pressure on this pawn. Of course, that's defended at the moment, but nevertheless, very active rook. The pawn structure on the queen side, very healthy. And, well, here, if Karjakin played, for example, d5, he's got a very solid pawn structure, and that kind of fixes this pawn on a dark square, which might be vulnerable later on. Certainly black has sufficient counterplay here. But Karjakin played what to my eyes is a very uncharacteristic move for him. He's normally a very responsible player, very prudent player, and he played extraordinary move, c5, which really wrecks his pawn structure on the queen side. It presents this square to the knight. It's possible it might use that square later on. I thought this was an extraordinary move, so out of character for Karjakin. Carlsen played rook g8, hitting the bishop. Good move. The king came back, and then the rook came all the way back to g2. So the rook started out on g1, but it ended up on g2. Now, why did Carlsen do this? Well, it defends the pawn on c2. So now the knight is actually threatening to take on f5. And there's a nice little tactic here. If the king comes up, defending that pawn, then Carlsen can take on c5. Now we're going to see the difference. The rook is not on g1, but it's on g2. Very important. And now there's a nice tactic. If king takes knight, then you can check on g5 and a little skewer, and you've won the bishop. And that's a pretty healthy extra pawn because black's pawns are split, looks pretty ugly. Good winning chances for white. So in this position, instead of defending that pawn, Karjakin took on d4. Knight takes f5, but this is still very healthy indeed for white. So knight takes pawn threatened, and Karjakin made the decision to give away that pawn, but at least he's managed to split white's pawn. So white has 4 isolated pawns against black's 3 isolated pawns. So it's a very messy position, but Carlsen is a clear pawn up. But this is not easy to win because of those split pawns and the fact that this rook here is very active. So it can hassle these pawns. Well, any of these pawns, in fact, and sometimes hassle the king as well. And that bishop at the moment looks a bit passive, but actually it's doing a good job of controlling those squares that the knight might hop into. So this is not easy to win, but it's quite clear that only 2 results are possible from this position. Either it'll be a draw or Carlsen will win. No winning chances for black at all. Now, let's leap ahead quite a few moves. Carlsen poked and probed. We joined the position just after move 60. They've just made the time control. Karjakin was a little bit short of time, but still, he's managed to trade a couple of pawns. So it's now rook, knight and 3 against rook, bishop and 2 pawns. And here, well, it's a solid blockade of the bishop. And if Karjakin now plays king g7, he should be all right in this position. I mean, Carlsen can still play to win. But instead, Karjakin blundered. He played bishop g5, and suddenly this gives white a chance. Of course, the rook is attacked, but the rook came forward. Now, the exchange of rooks will be of great benefit to white. Because all these pawns are on light squares, they can't be attacked, and very good. It should be pretty easy to win, actually. So check from the rook, but now the king advances, hitting the bishop. That's why bishop g5 is a mistake. Check, and the king comes to h5. That king can contribute to the attack. So the rook has to keep hold of that bishop, and that's annoying. So the bishop really has to move. It came back to e7. And now a check with the knight, checking the king. King came forward. Knight g4 check. The king has to keep hold of that bishop, so it has to come back. And now an excellent move from Magnus Carlsen. He played the rook to e6. Now that takes away this f6 square from the king. And now there's no really good defence to the threat of knight e5 pushing the king backwards. Now this is very nasty. Karjakin probably played the best defence, and that is he actually gave up his bishop. He took this pawn. So knight e5 check. And now if the king goes back to f8, then knight g6 forks king and bishop, or if the king goes back to e8, then f6 wins the piece. So Karjakin played king g7, giving up the bishop. So Carlsen has rook and knight against rook. I should say that the players are well into the 7th hour by this stage. So after the time control at move 60, they get 15 minutes added to their clock, plus 30 seconds each time they make a move. But you know, this is starting to be serious time pressure, actually. Clock was ticking down. It's not so easy. Now, Carlsen's a piece up. Is this an easy win? No, absolutely not. Well, first of all, the rook is attacked. So knight c6 from Carlsen, defending the rook. And then king takes f5. Now, Carlsen's problem is that if black is able to remove that last white pawn from the board, then it'll be a draw. Rook and knight against rook is a theoretical draw. So Carlsen has to keep hold of that pawn. Now, he played a very practical move here, knight a5. Good move, defending the pawn. Of course, the knight is a long way from the other side of the board. This is the problem, but this should be winning. Rook h1. Now this introduces counterplay, because that pawn might just zip down the board. And it's here where Carlsen missed a good shot. He played rook b7, which looks like a really tempting move to take that pawn. But we'll see that Karjakin has a good shot after that. He could have played rook check. Then king e4. Now, that gives white's king a little bit of room, and now the king can actually take care of the h-pawn on its own, and that gives the rook and the knight the freedom to, well, hold on to the b-pawn, actually. So, well, let me give you a little illustration of how things might run. So, if the rook comes over to try to disturb the position of the knight, well, let's say knight c6. if, well, let's say king d3, you can take the pawn. Okay, the rook is threatening this, but if we give a check, then if the king comes here, well, you can see that the knight can come back here, and you might be able to take that pawn actually, but I mean, this is a pretty safe move, knight d4 check, and this is suddenly looking very awkward for the king, and white is holding on to that pawn, and slowly the king will be able to shuffle back across the board. Here's an alternative. Rook g1 check, okay, king takes pawn, and now rook here, knight a5, holding on to that pawn, and if, say, rook a1, well, we come back again. Rook c7 cuts off the king. I mean, other moves might be possible, but I think this should be good. And here's a little tactic. The king wants to come towards the pawn, and of course if rook takes pawn, then knight c5 check. This should be winning. With a bit of care, this should be winning for white, because he can hold on to that pawn. But very tricky when you're short of time and you've been playing for something like 6.5 hours. Instead of this, instead of rook f7 check, Carlsen played rook b7. So it looks extremely tempting, because all he wanted to do was take black's pawn, but now rook a1, trying to disturb that knight. Check from Carlsen. The king comes forward. Now he takes the pawn, but now the king is able to support the pawn. The rook hassles the knight. Check. So the knight moves. Now, by the way, if, let's say, king takes pawn, then actually this is a very easy draw. The black king is going to approach the pawn, and it'll be a draw. So the knight came closer, but now black has sufficient counterplay with this h-pawn, and the knight just can't get close enough to the pawn. And now Carlsen even has to hurry to stop that pawn. So he played rook h4. So the pawn can't advance, but the king comes closer. And again, h2, h1 is a threat. Carlsen checked the king away. And they're repeating the position. And, well, here they actually agreed a draw. Nothing to do. Well, what a bitter disappointment for Magnus Carlsen, who were really outplayed Karjakin and came so close to winning the game. I can imagine he will be finding it very difficult to sleep tonight after that. For Karjakin, well, it's almost like a moral victory drawing this game, saving this game. That must give him enormous self-confidence going to the next games. And after such a long game, how much energy will the players have coming into game 4, which is being played on Tuesday? It follows straight on. Well, this game really shows why I love World Championship matches. It's really tough chess, and it's pretty relentless when you have to play a game the next day. So do join me for game 4 tomorrow.